basically, how long were you underground, Ken?
38 years.
38 years underground, basically. So I think he's being cremated, like he don't fancy anymore, you know, to be honest. But to speak on the Ukraine situation, because I mean, what's happening in this country? The press and the media have got this narrative that they're sticking to. But Ken is going to enlighten us a bit more on the current Ukraine situation. Ken Captick.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to change the subject of this meeting, in a sense, from what it says on the leaflet. I call this war Biden's war. I do not refer to it as Putin's war. I also have to make a bit of a disclaimer, because I'm a trustee of the Mine Workers Pension Scheme, and any views I express are not necessarily the views of my fellow trustees on the Mine Workers Pension Scheme. So, as we approach the first anniversary of the war in Ukraine, it is vital that we take a long, hard look at the real causes of the war, who bears responsibility for it and its consequences, and how will this catastrophic war end. I have leaned for parts of my speech on a lecture given by Professor John Mearsheimer, a professor at the University of Chicago. If you look him up on the internet, he makes a number of contributions that are well worth listening to in respect of the war in Ukraine. In the past year, the whole of the Western media has been commandeered and turned into the most one-sided war machine that I have ever known of, I think, in the history of the media in this country. And the same can no doubt be said about the Russian media. But I cannot comment on that, because access to it has been stopped and denied to me at the beginning of the war. We have all been prevented from hearing any alternative narrative to that presented by all Western media outlets. Never in my memory has the world's media been so blatantly appropriated, or should I say misappropriated, for such constant, one-sided, unchallengeable Western propaganda. Day after day, I have listened to news outlets, be it American outlets, France 24, Euronews, Al Jazeera, BBC, Sky News, to mention but a few, and heard embedded propaganda-trained journalists spin the same message: Ukraine good, even saintly, Russia bad, even evil. The first totally misleading narrative is that the war started with Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. By the way, that was my birthday. I bear no responsibility.
We'll sing happy birthday.
I don't bear any responsibility for my birthday either, really. But the war and its causes can be traced back to a NATO summit meeting in Bucharest, Romania, in April 2008, more than 14 years ago, to which Putin had been invited and was present and not seen as the dangerous representation of him that we are asked to believe today. And you'll probably hear me mention 2008 and the NATO summit on a number of occasions as I go through my speech. It was at that summit, in the knowledge that Putin was there, that NATO announced that Georgia and Ukraine would be integrated into NATO 14 years ago. It was a blatant provocation and an obvious signal to Putin that he and Russia were regarded as powerless in 2008 and in no position to prevent such a blatant enlargement. After all, had Russia not been so weakened by the collapse of the Soviet Union that it no longer had the power or the ability to prevent further NATO expansion, which would come on top of other tranches of NATO enlargement in the 1990s, and the Bush regime in Washington could and did pay scant regard to Putin's protests. The events that have followed from that NATO summit demonstrate that the United States and its allies have played a pivotal role in the conduct of the war and bear responsibility for the calamity that we see today. The United States and its leaders are at the very heart of this conflict. They instigated it. They set it in train. All of the events that have been created in Europe and have been amply assisted with varying degrees of enthusiasm by member states and other states, coerced into supporting what in the event has become Biden's war, not Putin's war. Ukraine, of course, is playing a central role. It is their people who are dying on and off the battlefield. Their homes and villages, towns and cities that are being destroyed, while others, thousands of miles away, egg them on and provide the military hardware for what seems like an endless and totally unnecessary war. America's and Biden's obsession with bringing Ukraine into NATO is in line with the 2008 Bucharest decision and pushing NATO right onto Russia's border, possibly with the intention of placing nuclear weapons there, pointed at Moscow and the massive threat that represents to Russia. I want to make the case that the United States has been the main driver of the events that have led to the war, and that Joe Biden has been central to those events. Under the Obama administration, Biden was vice president and was given responsibility for Ukraine and the drive towards its eventual membership of NATO. In 2013, we saw the Maidan uprising, supported by America. Senator John McCain and the US Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, inspiring demonstrations to violently attack the police. Nuland herself was seen handing out sandwiches to those building barricades and driving vehicles straight into the police lines and egging them on. Following the Maidan uprising in 2013, Nuland stated that the United States had invested $5 billion to bring about what was described as a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine. The real stated purpose of the United States was to bring Ukraine into NATO at all costs and in line with the Bucharest Declaration of 2008 to overthrow the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen as pro-Russian, which they saw, and Russia saw, as the brightest of red lines. The United States is principally responsible for causing this crisis and pushed policies in respect of Ukraine that Russia sees as an existential threat to Russia itself. But in the arrogant belief that Russia was no longer in a position to respond. A miscalculation, comrades, of monumental proportions, and for which millions of men, women and children on both sides are paying the ultimate price, not just in the war itself, but in the wider world as a result of the famine it has caused and other drastic global effects. If anyone should be indicted for war crimes, it is Biden himself. And you could go back and mention a few other American presidents as well. Putin in 2014 was aware of the developing situation in Ukraine, especially the US-supported riots taking place in the Maidan, which is in the center of Kiev, and the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, who had to abandon the presidential palace and run for his life to Russia on the 21st of February 2014. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Victoria Nuland's preferred candidate, was installed, not with an election, as Prime Minister 6 days later on the 27th of February 2014. It was clearly an American takeover of the Ukraine government. Almost simultaneously, on the 27th of February 2014, the same day that Yatsenyuk took office as Ukraine's Prime Minister, Russia moved to annex Crimea and a large area in the east of Ukraine was occupied by pro-Russian separatists who proclaimed the establishment of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, highlighting the real problem that Ukraine has, because it is not, and has not been, probably in its history, a united country. The west of Ukraine is pro-Western, but the east of Ukraine, along with Crimea, tends to be pro-Russian, with Russian-speaking ethnic Russians who identify more with Russia than they do with the west of Ukraine, and hope the Americans, Europeans, or NATO had of uniting the people of Ukraine and integrating them into NATO and the EU was a busted flush from almost the first day that war broke out in 2014. This led to talks between Russia and Ukraine, and hostilities continued, albeit at a less intense level. The current war and the 2014 war are not as a result of the sudden invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the 24th of February 2022 in response to the massive build-up of Ukraine troops armed to the teeth with Western sophisticated weaponry, NATO's high-level training and financing of the Ukraine army in anticipation of the fulfillment of the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest and the declaration by the US President George W. Bush and embraced by the Obama regime, the Trump regime, and now the Biden regime. From the moment of that Biden taking office in January 2021, seeing Ukraine as unfinished US business. It is said that Putin, who was present at the 2008 summit, flew into a rage and warned that if Ukraine joined NATO, it will do so without Crimea and the eastern region. At the 2008 summit again, Angela Merkel, the then German Chancellor, and Nicolas Sarkozy, former French president, were opposed to moving forward on NATO membership of Ukraine. Merkel said, and I quote, I am very sure that Putin is not going to let this happen. From his perspective, it would be a declaration of war. Washington couldn't have cared less about Russia's red lines and pressured the French and German leaders to agree to issuing a public announcement that made it absolutely clear that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually join the NATO alliance. Putin spoke to Western leaders in late 2021 and early 2022, including Biden, the days before the war, and could gain no assurances in respect of Western intentions and NATO's intentions in Ukraine, and the threat, as Putin saw it, remained. Biden's refusal in 2021 to eliminate that threat when he spoke to Putin prior to the war, when he should have known that Putin, having amassed thousands of troops on Ukraine's border, was deadly serious. And that makes Biden irresponsibly culpable. Professor John Mearsheimer, who I mentioned earlier, of the Chicago University, says in a video on YouTube, he never gets a chance to say it anywhere else, quotes, the United States is not interested in finding a diplomatic peace formula because it would represent a massive climb down. In essence, the US and its allies are leading Ukraine down this destructive path, unquote. The EU and NATO have been forced into Biden's war. It is crazy to pretend otherwise. We are asked to believe by the Western media and Western politicians that Putin is totally responsible for this war. Ridiculously. He is said to have ambitions to create a greater Russia. There is not a shred of evidence to support that. On the contrary, the wider ambitions are America's and NATO's wider ambitions. It has been the ambition since 1990 to encircle Russia with NATO supporting countries and NATO troops and sophisticated, high-powered weaponry. It isn't Putin that's wanting to take over the world. It's quite the opposite. And you only have to look at the situation to realise who it is that is pushing this war and wanting more and more territory and pushing further and further onto Russia's borders. On the outbreak of war on the 24th of February 2022, Putin said, quote, "It is not our plan to occupy Ukraine territory. But Russia cannot feel safe, develop and exist while facing a permanent threat from the territory of today's Ukraine," unquote. It is well known that Russia possesses vital, rich energy resources, mainly oil and gas. It uses about 27% of its gas for internal use, and that leaves 73% of its gas for export. America, by contrast, is energy deficient. It uses its own energy resources in an alarming rate and needs to acquire imported energy from other global sources like Saudi Arabia. A more compliant regime in Russia could open up Russia's considerable energy resources to American oil and gas multinationals. Pushing NATO right onto the borders of Russia in Ukraine and Georgia could be the prelude to further encroachment into a weakened Russia itself. Hence, the existential threat Russia perceives and has perceived since the declaration at the NATO summit in 2008. So Putin's opposition to the 2008 NATO threat had hardly any effect on Washington because Russia was still regarded as a busted flush since the downfall of the Soviet Union. This war and the 2014 war is not a result of the sudden invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the 24th of February 2022, but in response to the massive build-up and preparation of Ukraine troops over a number of years, armed to the teeth with Western sophisticated weaponry, NATO's high-level training and financing of the Ukraine army in anticipation of the fulfillment of the 2008 NATO Bucharest Declaration. It is said that Putin left the 2008 summit and flew into a rage and warned that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will do so without Crimea and the eastern region and its Russian-speaking ethnic Russian majority. William Burns, head of the CIA, was the UN ambassador to Moscow at the time of the Bucharest summit. He wrote a memo to the then Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, that succinctly described Russian thinking about Ukraine joining NATO. Burns warned, quote, Ukraine entry into NATO is the brightest of red lines to Russian elite, not just Putin. He also wrote, in more than 2.5 years of conversations with Russian players from the dark recesses of the Kremlin to the Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russia's interests. NATO, he said, would be seen as throwing down the strategic gauntlet. Today's Russia will respond. Russia-Ukraine relations will go into deep freeze, he said. He said that Putin is not an anomaly, that every member of the Russian elite viewed it as Putin viewed it. The Bush administration, which was determined to follow the policy through, cared little about Moscow's red lines and pressured the French and German leaders to agree to issuing a public announcement that said unequivocally that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually join the NATO alliance. These efforts eventually sparked the major crisis in 2014 after the American supported uprising in Ukraine, and pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych had to flee the country. He was replaced by Yatsenyuk in what was basically a US-inspired undemocratic coup. This from the US and Ukraine, both of whom protest to be protectors of democracy. It is clear that where American interests are involved, democracy is the last consideration. America, a country that has invaded one sovereign state after another since World War II, has the gall to complain about Putin and Russia today. War broke out in eastern Donbass between Kiev forces and ethnic Russian separatists in Donbass, who wanted nothing to do with the imposed Ukrainian government, NATO, or the European Union, and still doesn't. What you often hear is the argument that in the 8 years between that war breaking out in 2014 and 2022, the United States and its allies paid little attention to bringing Ukraine into NATO, and that the issue had been taken off the table. but in fact NATO began training Ukraine military in 2014, averaging 10,000 troops annually over the next 8 years. So NATO was training 10,000 Ukrainian troops over the next 8 years when it paid little interest. 80,000 Ukraine troops. Of course, America was involved up to its eyeballs between 2014 and the outbreak of war in 2022, and every single day since. Again, I'd refer to a video you might want to try and look up of Professor Mearsheimer, and he tells us in an excellent YouTube video that in 2017 the Trump administration decided to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons, and other NATO countries quickly joined into the act, shipping even more weapons to Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine's military participated in joint military exercises with NATO forces. In July 2021, just a few months after Biden took office, Kiev and Washington co-hosted Operation Sea Breeze, an operational exercise in the Black Sea that included navies from 31 countries. 31 countries in the Black Sea, and directed and aimed at Russia. So much for Russian aggression. Russia is not the aggressor. 2 months later, in September 21, Ukraine's army led Rapid Trident 2021, which was, according to an official press release from the US Army, a US Army Europe and Africa assisted annual exercises designed for interactability among allied and partner nations. It's obvious who the aggressor has been throughout the whole period, in my view, from 2008. Ukraine was being made into a de facto member of NATO. NATO's effort to arm and train Ukraine military explains why Ukraine has done so well against Russian forces in this ongoing war. Ukraine's President Zelensky, who had never shown much enthusiasm for bringing Ukraine into NATO, elected in March 2019 on a platform of working with Russia to settle the ongoing conflict, reversed course in 2021, almost immediately on Biden taking office, coinciding with that, and not only embracing NATO expansion, but also suddenly adopted a hardline approach towards Russia. Biden had long been committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO, and was also super hawkish towards Moscow. Biden was vice president in the Obama administration. President Obama had assigned Biden with the Ukraine portfolio. And of course, when they then left office and gave way to the Trump regime, Biden was left with unfinished business as far as he was concerned in respect of Russia and Ukraine. On the 14th of June 2021, NATO issued the following communique at its annual Brussels summit. Now, this is around 6 months, possibly less, into Biden's regime and Biden taking office as president. 14th of June 2021. We reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. We reaffirm all elements of that decision, as well as subsequent decisions, including that we reaffirm all demands of that decision, including that each member will be judged on its merits. We stand firm in our support for Ukraine's right to decide its own future, free from outside interference, unquote. Any outside interference in Ukraine had always been from America and NATO. Biden made it clear to Zelensky. Invited him to the White House to make it clear to him. In September 2021, that the US was firmly committed to Ukraine's Euro/Atlantic aspirations. That means NATO. And later, in November 2021, Antony Blinken signed a commitment to the US-Ukraine strategic partnership. It said, the aim of both parties is to underscore deep and comprehensive reform necessary for full integration into Europe and the Euro-Atlantic institutions, unquote. There is no doubt that this current crisis started and was initiated early in 2021, within weeks, if not days, of Biden taking office as Ukraine president, and the Ukraine began moving rapidly toward joining NATO. You might say that this posed no threat to Russia, but that's not how Russia saw it. And it's what Russia thinks, not what NATO or you or I might think. And they see NATO's expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia itself. They see it as the brightest of red lines, and have done so since the NATO summit in Bucharest. Putin, of course, could see this threat from the new Biden regime in 2021 and began development of Russian troops on Ukraine's deployment of Russian troops on Ukraine's border. On the 17th of December 2021, the Russians sent separate letters to NATO and to Biden, demanding a written guarantee. No, they sent it to NATO and to Biden. They didn't send it to Ukraine. They didn't send it to Zelensky. The Russians knew who were the drivers of this war. They knew it was Biden and NATO, which Biden and NATO is basically one and the same thing anyway. And they were asking for a written guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. No offensive weapons would be placed near Russia's borders. Troops and equipment moved into Western Europe would be moved back. Quite reasonable demands. I wonder how I wonder how America would feel if there were threats on America's borders. Never mind a balloon. Talking about serious threats here. It was during this period that Putin made it abundantly clear that he viewed NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia itself. Speaking in the Defence Ministry Board on the 21st of December 2021, Putin stated, what they are doing or planning to do in Ukraine is not happening thousands of kilometres from our national borders. It's happening on the doorstep of our house. Do you really think, he said, we do not see these threats? Or do they think that we will just stand idly by, watching threats to Russia emerge? 2 months later, at a press conference on the 22nd of February, 2 days before the war started, he said, we are categorically opposed to Ukraine joining NATO because this poses a threat to us, and we have arguments to support this. We have repeatedly spoken about it. He then made it clear that he recognised that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. The US and its allies, he said, continue to pump the Kiev authorities full of modern types of weapons. He went on to say that if this was not stopped, Moscow would be wrecked with an anti-Russia armed to its teeth, and this is totally unacceptable, unquote. Other Russian leaders, including the defense minister, the foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador to Washington, also emphasized the centrality of NATO expansion for causing the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly at a press conference on the 14th of January 2022 when he said, the key to everything is to guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward, unquote. All these efforts proved futile in getting the West, which was firmly in the grip of the Biden regime, to abandon aims to set out in the 2018 Bucharest summit. Secretary of State Antony Blinken responded to Russia. He responded to Russia. Not Zelensky. Blinken. And he simply and arrogantly said, there is no change, there will be no change. This is what Blinken said. There is no change, there will be no change. So what are the prospects for negotiating a peace and ending Biden's war? This war has cost thousands of human lives and will cost billions of dollars, if not trillions, to rebuild Ukraine. The stakes are high. There seems no easy way out of Biden's war. If Russia is driven back to its borders, the existential threat it fears becomes reality, with the prospect of nuclear weapons sitting on its borders, pointed at Moscow. If, on the other hand, Russia takes more territory, consolidates its gains, it represents a defeat and a massive humiliation for Washington and its 2008 declaration at the Bucharest summit. There's a serious possibility that nuclear weapons might be used in Ukraine and might lead to a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States if either side is facing defeat. The stakes are so high on both sides. We are already seeing escalation after escalation after escalation taking place, especially in recent days, in response to Russia's recent advances. The tragedy is that the wiser counsel of Merkel and Sarkozy, who understood the Russians better, didn't prevail at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008. And instead, the hot-headedness of George W. Bush and now Biden and the US presidents in between, Obama and Trump, it is unlikely there would be a war in Ukraine had their advice been adhered to. Today, and Ukraine are in a mess. Still would be part of Ukraine, Crimea. In essence, Bucharest in 2008 planted the seed for a catastrophic war which now threatens the whole of mankind. History will judge the United States and NATO with abundant harshness for its remarkably foolish policy in Ukraine.
Thanks, Ken, for that succinct and comprehensive look at the Ukraine situation. Anybody got any questions or for Ken or comments?
Could you speak up?
You said in your speech, which I very much enjoyed, that it's Biden that should be up for war crimes, but you didn't comment on the Russian atrocities in Ukraine, which have been well documented.
Well,
So
I don't know how well. First of all,
I take your point that Biden, but Putin's got to go as well.
yeah. Well, first of all, I only hear about the war in Ukraine and alleged atrocities on both sides from a very biased media. I've referred to that. I deplore any atrocities. Can I tell you, I'll go one stage further. I deplore war itself.
Yeah.
War itself is an atrocity from the minute it starts. What I've tried to address here is who is to blame for this war. And whoever is to blame for this war, which had no need to take place, is responsible for every atrocity that takes place in it. And I've already set out who I think is to blame.
Can I just say on one of the atrocities, which has been allegedly put at the Russian door, is the Bucha massacre. Now, if you look at what Scott Ritter has said about that, when the Ukrainians retook Bucha, the mayor of Bucha It's made no reference whatsoever to any atrocity by Russian troops. Bear in mind that these bodies were strewn in the street with their hands tied behind the back and been shot in the back of the head. But what we do know is that there was a so-called cleansing operation by Ukraine security personnel who were basically going out and liquidating people who had, as they put it, collaborated with the Russian forces. Now, what the Russian troops were doing were handing out humanitarian aid, food and water, etc., to the residents living there, and they were then seen as collaborators. But the point that Scott Ritter makes is this, that the allegations about this massacre in Bucha emerged, I think it was 3, possibly 4 days after the Russian troops had pulled out. And Scott Ritter, of course, was a UN weapons inspector. You know, he'd served in the military, he'd seen dead bodies. And what he said was that there is no way that the Russian troops could have killed those people because the state of the bodies would have been decomposing by that time, but they weren't. And so his view was that it was Ukrainian forces that had actually killed. So yes, I'm saying there's not been atrocities on both sides. I don't know. But what I do know is that there's a hell of a lot of propaganda going on out there, and that was one case in point, which I think Scott Ritter has comprehensively proven could not have actually been perpetrated by Russian troops. And yet we're still hearing, aren't we, that it was Russia Putin was responsible for that. And anybody who dares to actually put forward an alternative narrative, we are dismissed as Putin apologists.
Also, there's a thing, let me show you that there's a book been written about the Ukraine war. And there's one thing that's very, it was recommended in the Morning Star, where one thing that they told Zelensky, if he ever negotiated, this is the fascist element, and Putin's dead right, there's a fascist element still there, that they'd murder him. So it's an interesting book, it's been an eye-opener, and I fully recommend it to anybody.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, we see demonisation before that dreadful Scargill and all that type of business. You know what I mean? You demonise a person, basically, don't you? You sort of. Well, thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, just one point on the last comment that was made regarding the ultra-rightists in Ukraine, following in the steps of their nationalist leader Stepan Banderas, who collaborated with the Nazis during the war.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
In fact, the Gestapo had to lock him up because even they couldn't stomach his level of violence. I think he was assassinated after the war by the Russian KGB.
Yes.
But these are the elements that are still alive in Ukraine today. And as you just said,
it comes in the book, brings it quite out about the fascist element. Putin was right on that, there is.
And these elements thrive on war, no matter where it comes from, and what the reasons are for it are. The reasons for it are not just geopolitical, in my opinion. I just think there's a massive agenda to cause war for the World Economic Forum's agendas. Population,
industrial complex, absolutely. Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about that back in 1961, actually, the very point that you're making, actually. So, he was a Republican president,
Just to say thanks for Ken's speech. I thought it was very deep. I thought it charted the whole movement towards where we are today with this war. But the thing you said about NATO was quite interesting, I think, because I forget which general it was when they were setting up NATO.
I have no cash at all,
They
sorry.
succinctly said the purpose of NATO is to keep the communists out, to keep the Germans down, and to keep the Americans in. It seems to me, and something that's happened quite recently, the blowing up of Nord Stream 2, which is an American blowing up of Nord Stream 2.
Yes.
An act of war against Russia. Clear act of war, which has two things. It keeps the American in, and it keeps the Germans down, because it's the German oil supplies, gas supplies, that they have taken control of by blowing up Nord Stream 2. And I think what I'm going to take away from today's meeting is the systemic crisis that we're all faced with, whether it's the collapse of capitalism and its ability to even care for our elderly at the beginning of the meeting, questions around what we do as a people, what we do as a class, being asked of the Labour Party and it being found wanting, and the unstoppable drive to war as part of the profiteering engine, which is capitalism. Because the other thing that's happening in this, of course, they don't mind the destruction of the Ukraine. They didn't mind the destruction of the Middle East. They didn't mind the destruction of Libya, because and the Balkans, because they will get in to rebuild it and profit from the rebuilding. That's apart from the immense amount of profit, because they're not donating all this weaponry to bloody Ukraine. They didn't donate. The Americans didn't donate the fucking weapons here in the 1939-45 period.
No.
They sold it to us, everything, and it took us 50 years. We only paid it back about 10 years ago. We paid the last, dollar back to the Americans for its defence of democracy in Europe against fascism.
Yes.
And they're at it again, comrades. They're at it again, and it's almost a rerun of the 30s. Conference by conference, you can go back, and if you look at that driving to World War II, it's almost there, and often with the same players. And isn't it interesting that Zelensky comes, and what do we have to do? He has to bloody well trumpet Churchill. Churchill has to be the message. The message is, get yourself back into World War II mode, Europe, because here we go again. And
Yes.
it's this movement that needs to be built, and built very rapidly now, given the fact that the Labour Party is declared for the war machine,
Absolutely.
and the Labour Party is declared for imperialism. We've got to build a movement as fast as we can if we're to stop what is clearly, or as Ken clearly says at the end of his speech, an immediate threat to humanity. We are already in World War III in that sense. We've got to stop it. And the only way we know as socialists to stop it is not to tinker around the edges of the capitalist system, but to overthrow it once and for all and build a rational, socialist, peaceful society.
Absolutely. And as well as that, there's another thing as well, and that is, you ask yourself the question, why hasn't the cost of a Bosch washing machine gone through the roof in recent years? Because it's being made in another European company and not Germany. The aftermath of World War II was a desire not, for the German worker never to flirt with Nazism again. So they were, that's made the German worker a comparatively expensive guy to employ, and therefore the EC. The bound, at the negotiations with former Eastern Bloc countries, they're bound to say, look, you'll be getting the factories and all this type of thing. We'll be, we'll be getting it from somewhere else, basically, but you'll be getting the jobs and the factories and stuff, because you'll work cheaper. And that's the whole idea, destabilising Ukraine and Georgia and places, somewhere cheaper for German goods to be made.
Can I just relate something to you? The strikes that are taking place are due to the massive inflation that we see. And the massive inflation we see is due to the war. They don't say that much, they'll try and blame anything else, but there's no doubt about it in my mind that when the pipelines got blown up and when we were no longer taking gas from Russia to Germany and then distributing it, we were forced to end up with massive inflation. And I wish that the trade unions that are taking action now would relate their addresses more to the war. Because there's no doubt about it that the war is the cause of a lot of that. So I was asked by The Guardian to write 900 words about the strikes taking place. So I did. And I did address the strikes and the causes for the strikes, and especially the inflation rate that I think at the time was running at 14.1%, and the offers that were being made of about 5% to some and less to others. And I took a chance And I went on to say, and the cause of the inflation is the war taking place in Ukraine between Russia and NATO. Not between Russia and Ukraine. Between Russia and NATO. And I went on to express my view that NATO was responsible, or America was responsible for the war. You can imagine the consternation it caused. I immediately received a response saying, we would rather you hadn't mentioned the war.
Don't mention the war. I'll mention it once I think about it.
It is, the two things, they said, are not connected. Now this was the person who was the editor of The Guardian online, who was interacting with me, going backwards and forwards, because I went back and said, I totally disagree. The two things are clearly connected. The inflation that we see is due to the war. The strikes we see are due to the inflation and therefore the war. So the two things are connected. And I refused to change my article.
It's all connected.
I stuck to my ground, and eventually, with a little bit of nudging here and there, we did agree, because one thing I didn't want to do, I wanted to stick to my position, but I didn't want to lose the whole of my article if they said, well, we're not going to publish your article. Because biggest part of my article, probably 85% or more of it, was supporting the strikes that were taking place all over the place, even the lawyers that were on strike. And eventually I got a word in that I agreed to, and it said that basically that the war in Ukraine was a war between Russia and NATO taking place in Ukraine. That was agreed. I was told that the article would be going in The Guardian online on the Saturday, which was late in January, and it would also be in The Guardian itself. Oh, very good. I'm getting both. Oh, I did get both. And when I read The Guardian, it said, Russia's war in Ukraine is causing the massive inflation. I went absolutely bananas. But who with? I got in touch with the editor of The Guardian Online. They called her Hetty O'Brien. And Hetty immediately came back to me in a text, got it on my phone, apologising to me, and saying, I do not know how this has happened. Well, actually, in a funny sort of a way, I believed her. And I believed her for one reason and one reason alone. She put it in writing. She put it in writing. I have it here. And apologised to me and said, we'll correct it. I said, you can't correct it in The Guardian, that's gone all over the country.
No.
She said, no, but we can correct it on The Guardian Online at least. To be fair to her, she did. So The Guardian Online got corrected because I made a big issue about it and said I would want to take it up with whoever, the press council or whatever that I'd been, I felt completely and utterly cheated with that article. But I couldn't get they appointed a woman from The Guardian who was going to look at this dispassionately, or look at it and make a fair decision. She did, in as much as she changed the Guardian Online article to my wording. But she didn't do anything about the Guardian that went all over the country, which looked like I was condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine, when I didn't. So it's an example of what I was saying about the way that the media has been completely commandeered and twisted. And it's lost all sense of balance. And the best example, or the worst example, I should say, the worst example I see, I watch France 24. I don't know if anybody else bothers to watch that. And they have a program on there called The Debate. It's French, is it? What's French for debate? Is it débat or something? I don't know. But anyway, it's called The Debate. I mean, to call it a debate, it just beggars belief. I was very fortunate in the early 1970s when the NUM paid for me day release to go to Leeds University for 3 years. And I was asked to write certain essays. One was to debate. I was asked to debate whether fireworks should be banned or not. When I did it and handed it in, the tutor said to me, "This is no good." Marked me down on it. I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you haven't debated it." He says, "You've argued one point of view. A debate is both.
Yeah.
You have to put both points of view, or it's not a debate. And it's not a discussion." So he gave it, he said, "Take it away, redo it and bring it back. And I want you to debate it." I watched this programme on France 24 and it's called The Debate. Every single time I've watched it, which is numerous because it's on every day, there's a presenter, you might say a chair person, and 4 people to debate the war in Ukraine. It certainly wouldn't pass the Leeds University test for a debate. All 5 of them, every single time, are putting the pro-NATO point of view. Russia bad, Russia evil. Ukraine good, even saintly. And you know, I've related to that. I didn't put it in my speech, but I've taken the chance here to relate to what happened to me and my experience with The Guardian. It was shocking.
We're all though, Ken, aren't we? Everything you see in the mainstream is propaganda.
Of course.
Oh yeah.
Isn't it the old adage that the first casualty of war is
Yeah,
truth?
Well, I've stopped-
exactly that.
I've stopped buying chicken Kievs because I can't pronounce the new name for it.
Well, that's how bad it's
I've got a statement here that's been signed by significant trade union leaders calling for all of Britain's surplus weaponry, fighter jets, tanks, armoured vehicles and the rest of it to be sent to Ukraine. It includes Gary Smith, the General Secretary of the GMB, Barbara Plant, the GMB who's the President, Nick Whelan, ASLEF General Secretary, Chris Kitchen, NUM General Secretary, Simon Weller from the Assistant Secretary of ASLEF, and PCS Assistant General Secretary John Maloney, and the list goes on. I mean, you know, it's kind of shocking, really. I
What
mean,
chance have
Ken's
we got?
point about, you know, the trade union movement, you know, making the point, I think is really valid, and they do need to be doing that, and they certainly shouldn't be indulging in that kind of propaganda. And this is where I think members, grassroots members, need to be, you know, bringing pressure to bear on the trade union leadership, because you know they're completely wrong on this issue, completely wrong, and you know they're leading us down John Mearsheimer said, the primrose path. You know, we're on course potentially for World War III and nuclear annihilation.
Well, they're taking the Labour Party view, aren't they? You know,
Well,
That's
indeed.
what
Yeah.
happens when you're affiliated to the Labour Party.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Like the Labour Party
Yeah.
do.
Well, thanks to
Paul,
Paul.
then,
Oh, sorry.
No, thank you. I mean, what Chris has just read out is absolutely shocking,
Hello.
and it's a testament really to the actual efficacy of the propaganda that we've
Yeah.
been subjected to. I mean, where is the anti-war movement?
Mm-hmm.
Iraq war brought millions onto the streets. Where is the anti-war movement now?
Well, No to NATO, No to War is on the 25th of February in central London. We've had 2 venues cancel on us, so we're withholding the actual location until the last moment, but we're trying to build it there. And I've already said Socialist Labour Party members and Workers' Party members are collaborating, working together to try and bring that to being. There is also a Stop the War coalition rally on the same day, unfortunately. We did invite them to participate in ours and then they organise their own thing. So it's there, and we're also building transatlantic links as well. So we've already made connections with like-minded individuals in the US and in Europe. And ultimately, what we're looking to do is build a worldwide campaign against NATO. It's absolutely essential. It's desperately needed because they are leading us down a very, very dangerous road. Indeed.
Can I say one thing about the press? I went to the press, the Burton Mail, asked them if there was interest in putting in about our meeting. Got no results. I thought I'm not going to give up, so I got the editor on. And she said, yeah, I'll put it in a couple of days. She didn't put it in. I don't know, and it makes you wonder because we're talking about the Ukraine war, they didn't want to. So I went to the advertising, it was quite expensive, it cost £174. But I thought, I'm going to beat you no matter what. So of course it was making money, so the advertising, oh yes, we'll put it in on Friday for you. And so we got it in, and I'd like to see the editor's face when that advert went in on the paper. So we did beat them, but it just shows the cantankerousness of them, and again, particularly the Burton Mail gets more and more right-wing day by day.
Well, thanks very much to Paul. Thanks very much to Chris and to Ken, and thank you for coming and making it a successful meeting. We've got an excellent opportunity now, with such a vacuum at the heart of the British political system. With anybody who wants to join the SLP will be more than welcome. And as I say, to keep it a movement and not a monument, you need young people in, you need young blood in, basically. So, but I think we've got an excellent opportunity now that, with the likes of Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting and people in charge of the Labour Party, to be honest, I think we've got a wonderful opportunity to create a new driving force on the left of the British political spectrum. Thank you so much for turning up. Thank you.